70% of reported accidents at seasonal youth camps in North America involve water, not fire, not wildlife, not strangers. And yet when people remember their worst summer, they rarely talk about the lake first. They talk about the feeling that something was off. Lesser known fact: the design of most temporary camp docks follows floating load standards of roughly 40 pounds per square foot, a number borrowed from small marina guidelines rather than child-specific safety research. I arrived at Camp Oakwood in late June, when the air still carried coolness of spring in the mornings. The road of gravel curved through trees of oak and pine, and the sign was hand-painted, the kind of sign meant to look old even when it isn't. The first sound I remember was not laughter of kids, but the hum of a generator somewhere behind the main lodge. Lesser known fact: many rural camps rely on portable diesel generators rated between 10 and 30 kilowatts, which require daily checks of oil level because continuous summer load strains small engines. Camps like Oakwood exist in a narrow margin of regulation. In the United States and Canada, oversight is often split between state health departments, local fire codes, and voluntary accreditation bodies such as the American Camp Association. That means compliance can be thorough in one area and loose in another, depending on budget and inspection cycles. Lesser known fact: accreditation of the American Camp Association is voluntary and requires renewal every 3 years, leaving long intervals where standards may drift without formal review. The first night, the cabins smelled of wood sealant and damp fabric. 20 bunks in a rectangle, metal frames, thin mattresses, names written on masking tape. I remember the rhythm of crickets and the snap of cooling beams after sunset. Lesser known fact: treated lumber used in many outdoor structures contains copper-based preservatives that can emit a faint metallic odor and heat, especially during the first season after application. There is a doctrine of supervision at camps that sounds simple: 2 deep leadership. 2 adults present at all times with minors. It is designed to prevent abuse and false accusation alike, a policy born of lawsuits and hard lessons of the 1980s and 1990s. Lesser known fact: the 2-adult rule is now embedded in policies of organizations like the Boy Scouts of America, whose reforms followed multi-million-dollar settlements tied to past failures of oversight. On the second day, I watched a swim test. Kids lined up on the dock, shivering though the sun was already high. They jumped, and one by one, swam to a buoy, floated, came back. Some thrashed in panic halfway out, and lifeguards moved with practiced calm. Lesser known fact: the average depth of man-made camp lakes is often under 12 feet, shallow enough to warm quickly, but deep enough to conceal sudden drop-offs from erosion. The reason swim tests feel so strict is math. Drowning can occur in under 2 minutes, and silent drowning does not look like flailing. It looks like climbing an invisible ladder. Camps calculate ratios 1 lifeguard per 25 swimmers in many jurisdictions, but ratios assume clear sight lines and stable footing. Lesser known facts: glare off water can reduce visual detection of distress by up to 50% at certain sun angles, which is why polarized lenses are recommended for lifeguards. By the 3rd evening, something small shifted. The walkie-talkies started to crackle with static even when no one pressed the button. I would hear a half-formed word, then nothing. The counselors joked about ghosts because humor is a shield. Lesser known fact: most consumer-grade camp radios operate on UHF frequencies around 462 to 467 megahertz, which are vulnerable to interference from weather patterns and nearby repeaters. Radio discipline is not instinctive, it is trained. Short transmissions, clear identifiers, no overlap. In emergency management doctrine, confusion of communication compounds risk more than equipment failure alone. Lesser known fact: after Hurricane Katrina, Communication breakdown was cited in multiple federal reviews as a primary factor in delayed response, prompting investment in interoperable radio systems across agencies. One afternoon, I walked a perimeter trail that circled the property. The woods were thicker than I expected, with undergrowth that swallowed sound. I noticed markers tied to trees with orange tape, but some were faded, some missing. Lesser known fact, trail marking tape, often made of PVC, degrades under ultraviolet light in a single season if not UV-stabilized. Boundaries of camps are often informal. Property lines follow old survey markers, sometimes stones, sometimes metal stakes driven decades earlier. When land changes hands, records can lag behind reality. Lesser known fact, rural land surveys in North America before the 1970s were often conducted with chain and compass methods, producing errors that can exceed several feet over long distances. That night, a storm rolled in without warning. Wind moved through trees like a train, and branches scraped roofs. We counted heads twice in each cabin because thunder makes children forget instructions. Lesser known fact, summer convective storms can produce wind gusts over 60 miles per hour even without tornado formation. Strong enough to fell shallow-rooted trees. Emergency drills at camps are uneven. Fire drills are common. Severe weather drills less so. Depending on region, the doctrine assumes that storms pass quickly, that shelter in place is enough. Lesser known fact, according to the National Weather Service, lightning kills an average of around 20 people per year in the United States, many of them outdoors during recreational activities. After the storm, the generator failed. Lights flickered, then died, leaving only battery lanterns and the glow of phones. I could hear staff whispering in the lodge about fuel levels and maintenance logs. Lesser known fact, small diesel generators consume roughly 0.4 gallons of fuel per kilowatt hour at half load, meaning a 20 kilowatt unit can burn several gallons per hour under strain. Maintenance at seasonal facilities is compressed into short windows. Off-season budgets are thin, and inspections are often visual rather than mechanical. Bearings wear, filters clog. A single skipped oil change can shorten engine life by half. Lesser known fact, engine manufacturers often specify oil changes every 100 to 250 hours for small industrial generators, a schedule easy to exceed during continuous summer operation. In the dark, sounds grow larger. A door creaks somewhere in the stove cabin, and someone swore under their breath. I felt the weight of responsibility more than fear. 30 kids asleep, and no grid power. Lesser known fact, studies of group supervision show that perceived responsibility increases cortisol levels even without immediate threat, affecting decision-making speed. The weirdness was not a monster in the woods. It was accumulation. Missing trail markers, radios that cut out, a generator that coughed and stalled. Each thing small, but together they made a pattern of neglect. Lesser known fact, an accident investigation. The Swiss cheese model of James Reason describes how multiple small failures align to create disaster, rather than one dramatic cause. The next morning, the camp director gathered staff on the porch. He spoke of budget delays, of late shipments, of a supplier that had gone out of business. He asked for patience. Lesser known fact, supply chain disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic increased lead times for industrial parts by weeks or months, particularly for imported electrical components from a systems perspective. Camps operate like small municipalities without tax bases. They must manage water treatment, food safety, transportation, and healthcare in miniature. Yet they often rely on seasonal employees with minimal technical training. Lesser known fact, private wells at camps require regular bacterial testing, typically for coliforms to meet local health standards. At the waterfront, I noticed the buoy line had sagged. The rope dipped deeper in the middle than before. When I pulled it, tension felt uneven, like one anchor had shifted. Lesser known fact: anchor blocks for swim lines are often concrete weights of 50 to 100 pounds, susceptible to movement and soft sediment after storms. Storm runoff changes lakes, sediment moves, anchors drag, what looks like stable boundary can drift overnight. Doctrine of waterfront safety assumes fixed markers, but nature does not honor that assumption. Lesser known fact: heavy rainfall can increase turbidity of small lakes dramatically, reducing underwater visibility to near zero within hours. We adjusted the line manually, 2 of us in a canoe, tugging and retying knots. It felt improvised because it was. The kids never knew. Lesser known fact: knot failure under cyclic load is common when ropes are synthetic and wet. Certain knots lose up to 40% of rated strength when repeatedly soaked and dried. Improvisation is part of field leadership. Training teaches procedures, but reality teaches workarounds. Camps borrow doctrine from scouting, from outdoor education, from lifeguard manuals, but rarely from formal risk engineering. Lesser known fact: higher liability organizations, like nuclear plants, invest heavily in redundancy and preoccupation with failure. Concepts rarely applied in recreational settings due to costs. By mid-season, fatigue set in. Counselors slept 6 hours a night, sometimes less during special events. Patience thinned. Small arguments flared over scheduling and chores. Lesser known fact: cognitive performance declines measurably after 17 hours of wakefulness, comparable to a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05%. Fatigue compounds hazard. In aviation and medicine, duty hour limits exist for a reason. At camps, enthusiasm substitutes for regulation. The system depends on goodwill and caffeine. Lesser known fact: the Federal Aviation Administration mandates maximum duty periods for pilots, often around 8 to 9 hours of flight time, to manage fatigue-related risk. One afternoon, a camper went missing for 12 minutes. 12 minutes does not sound like much until you are counting them. We searched cabins, bathrooms, shoreline. I felt my throat tighten with each unanswered call of his name. Lesser known fact: in lost person incidents involving children in wilderness settings, the majority are found within the first hour, but outcomes worsen sharply after that window. He turned up behind the archery range, chasing a frog. He had not heard the whistle because his earbuds were in. Relief washed over us, followed by quiet anger at ourselves. Lesser known fact: archery ranges at camps are typically set with a minimum safety buffer of 150 feet beyond targets, according to industry guidelines, to account for stray arrows. The real risk was not the frog. It was communication. Whistles, radios, visual checks, each layer assumed attention. Remove one, and the chain thins. Lesser known fact: redundancy in safety systems is most effective when layers are independent. Shared failure modes, like reliance on hearing, undermine protection. The weird feeling returned that evening when I reviewed incident logs. There were more entries than usual for minor injuries: twisted ankles, mild dehydration, bee stings, none severe, but trending upward. Lesser known fact: dehydration can reduce physical performance by as little as 2% of body weight loss, increasing the likelihood of missteps and falls. Heat index climbed above 95 degrees Fahrenheit that week. Shade helped, but humidity wrapped around skin like wet cloth. Kids complained of headaches. Lesser known facts: children are more susceptible to heat illness because their thermoregulation mechanisms are less efficient than those of adults. Hydration protocols exist toward breaks every hour. Electrolyte drinks on long hikes, but compliance depends on enforcement. Counselors must model behavior, not just instruct it. Lesser known fact: Electrolyte imbalance, particularly low sodium, can also occur if water intake is excessive without salt replacement, a condition known as hyponatremia. One night, a parent called the office in panic. Her daughter had texted that something felt wrong at camp. Not abuse, not danger, just wrong. The director reassured her, citing policies and supervision. Lesser known fact: perception of safety among parents correlates strongly with communication frequency. Camps that provide daily updates report higher retention rates. Trust is fragile. Once a doubt enters, every creak of floorboard becomes suspect. Systems must not only function, they must appear to function. Lesser known fact: risk communication. Research shows that transparency about minor incidents can increase overall trust, even when it reveals imperfection. As weeks passed, the pattern sharpened. Maintenance deferred. Staff stretched thin. Supplies rationed quietly. The weirdness was the gap between brochure and reality. Lesser known fact: nonprofit camps often operate on margins under 5%, leaving little buffer for unexpected repair or staffing costs. In the final week, the generator failed again, this time during a heat advisory. We moved kids to shaded areas, rotated activities, improvised fans with cardboard. The director called. A repair company 2 counties away? Lesser known fact: rural service response times for specialized technicians can exceed 24 hours due to travel distance and limited workforce. This was the convergence. Not a single dramatic event, but a system running hot with no redundancy. Left: fatigue, heat, thin budgets, aging equipment, each alone manageable, together brittle. Lesser known fact: complex systems under stress often exhibit what engineers call graceful degradation until a tipping point, after which failure can be rapid and disproportionate. When I left Camp Oakwood at the end of summer, nothing catastrophic had happened. No headline, no lawsuit. But I carried a quiet understanding of risk that lingers longer than fear. Lesser known fact: many serious incidents in recreational settings are preceded by months of minor warnings that go unaddressed, documented in retrospective safety audits. The real horror was not a monster in the woods. It was the math of neglect, the arithmetic of small compromises added day after day. Camps promise growth and adventure, and often they deliver. Yet beneath the songs and campfires lies infrastructure, maintenance schedules, doctrine of supervision, and the fragile chain of human attention. Lesser known fact: resilience of any organization depends less on heroics and more on consistent adherence to boring routines, subsension, documentation. Rest: I still remember the hum of that generator even after it went silent. It was the sound of a system trying to keep up with its own promises. And in that hum, fading into summer night, was the lesson of Camp Oakwood. Weird is often just warning, spoken softly before it has to shout. In 2018, more than 4,000 children in the United States were treated in emergency rooms for injuries that happened at organized camps, and most of those incidents were classified as preventable. That number is not dramatic enough for headlines, but it is large enough to tell you something about fragility of systems built on optimism. Lesser known fact: according to surveillance data from the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, a significant portion of camp-related injuries involve sports equipment and falls rather than environmental hazards. The week after the second generator failure, I started waking up before my alarm. Not from noise, from anticipation. The air in the cabin felt heavier, like a room that had not been aired out properly. And I would lie there listening to breathing of 20 boys and counting it without meaning to. Lesser known fact: indoor air quality in temporary or seasonal housing can deteriorate quickly because ventilation systems are often natural flow only, relying on windows rather than mechanical exchange rates. Ventilation is not glamorous, but it is measurable. Recommended air changes per hour in sleeping quarters vary. Yet many guidelines suggest at least 0.35 air changes per hour to reduce buildup of carbon dioxide and humidity. In cabins with sealed windows during storms or heat, that rate drops below healthy thresholds. Lesser known fact: elevated indoor carbon dioxide levels above 1,000 parts per million have been associated with reduced cognitive function and increased perception of stuffiness. One morning, a counselor named Eric snapped at a camper for dropping a tray in the dining hall. It was a small outburst, sharp and brief, but it hung in the air longer than the sound of metal on concrete. I watched his face afterward. He looked surprised at himself. Lesser known fact: chronic sleep restriction of even 1 hour per night over a week can produce measurable mood instability and reduced impulse control in high reliability environment submarines. Air traffic control towers fatigue management is formalized. Rotations are planned, relief is mandatory, monitoring is constant. At camps, scheduling is often built around activities rather than human limits. Lesser known fact: U.S. Navy submarine crews operate on structured watch bills that distribute workload evenly to reduce cumulative fatigue during long deployments. By mid-July, maintenance of the waterfront became a daily improvisation. The buoy line drifted again after a minor storm, and algae bloom crept across the shallow end. The water looked fine from distance, greenish but calm. Up close, it smelled faintly metallic. Lesser known fact: harmful algal blooms can produce toxins such as microcystins, which are not always visible to the naked eye, and can cause skin irritation or gastrointestinal illness. Testing of lake water at private camps varies by jurisdiction. Some require weekly bacterial testing. Others rely on visual inspection and chlorine treatment of designated swim areas. Natural lakes cannot be sterilized the way pools can. Lesser known fact: Escherichia coli levels above 235 colony forming units per 100 milliliters are often used as a threshold for recreational water. Advisories in the United States: we kept swimming because test kits had not yet shown red flags, or because results were delayed, or because closing waterfront would unravel schedule of the entire week. I remember the internal negotiation: risk versus disruption. Lesser known fact: risk normalization occurs when repeated exposure to small hazards without immediate consequence reduces perception of danger, a concept documented in safety psychology. On the archery range, targets began to lean. Wooden stands, softened by humidity, warped slightly, shifting angles of impact. Arrows struck lower than expected, and campers compensated without understanding why. Lesser known fact: wooden structures exposed to sustained humidity above 20% moisture content are susceptible to dimensional change and fungal growth. Ballistics at low speeds, like archery, are sensitive to small changes in angle and tension. A misaligned target can redirect arrows unpredictably, increasing hazard radius beyond planned safety buffer. Lesser known fact: traditional recurve bows used in camps often have draw weights between 15 and 25 pounds for use, sufficient to penetrate plywood at short distance. I started documenting everything, not because policy required it, but because intuition did. Dates of repairs, names of counselors on duty, notes about radio interference. It felt like building a map of invisible cracks. Lesser known fact: after-action reporting in military units emphasizes contemporaneous note-taking because memory degrades quickly under stress. Distorting timelines, documentation serves two masters: prevention and liability. If nothing happens, it looks obsessive. If something does happen, it becomes lifeline. Lesser known fact: in civil litigation involving youth programs, maintenance logs and supervision records are often central evidence in determining negligence. 1. Afternoon, smoke drifted from the kitchen dumpster. Not flames, just a slow curl of gray rising in still air. Someone had thrown hot charcoal from a cookout into plastic bags. We stomped it out with buckets before it spread. Lesser known fact: spontaneous ignition of trash containing hot embers is a common cause of small facility fires, particularly in summer when waste sits uncollected for days. Fire doctrine in camps focuses on cabins, not dumpsters. Evacuation maps are posted by doors, yet external ignition sources are sometimes overlooked. Lesser known fact: the National Fire Protection Association reports that outdoor trash and rubbish fires account for thousands of incidents annually in the United States. By now, the weirdness felt less mysterious and more systemic. Small oversights multiplied because no single person owned the whole picture. Each department handled its slice waterfront, kitchen, maintenance without centralized risk review. Lesser known fact: organizational silos are a documented contributor to safety failures, as seen in analyses of industrial accidents like the Texas City refinery explosion. Centralization costs money. Hiring a full-time risk manager for a seasonal camp is rare. Instead, directors juggle fundraising with operations. Lesser known fact: nonprofit executive directors often spend over 50% of their time on development and donor relations rather than operational oversight. One camper developed a rash after swimming, red patches along arms and torso. The nurse suspected swimmer's itch, a reaction to parasites present in fresh water. We posted temporary warning signs, handwritten and taped. Lesser known fact: swimmer's itch is caused by cercoria of certain parasites that mistakenly penetrate human skin but cannot survive, leading to allergic response. Medical doctrine at camps relies on triage and referral. Most facilities have at least one staff member certified in basic life support, sometimes a registered nurse, but advanced care is miles away. Lesser known fact: average response time of rural emergency medical services can exceed 15 minutes, significantly longer than urban counterparts. 15 minutes is abstract until you imagine an airway compromised or anaphylaxis progressing epinephrine. Auto-injectors sit in locked cabinets, expiration dates circled in marker. Lesser known fact: epinephrine degrades over time and with exposure to heat, losing potency even before official expiration date if stored improperly. We conducted a surprise fire drill one humid evening. Half the cabin exited quickly. The other half searched for shoes first, then water bottles. Habit overrides instruction. Lesser known fact: in emergency behavior studies, individuals often attempt to complete familiar routines before evacuating, delaying escape. Training must compete with instinct. Drills must be repeated until reflex overrides comfort. Yet repetition breeds complacency if nothing bad ever follows. Lesser known fact: frequency of drills correlates with improved evacuation times, but only when drills vary scenarios rather than repeating identical scripts. By late July, staff turnover began quietly. 2 counselors left early, citing family reasons. Their replacements arrived with minimal orientation, absorbing protocols on the fly. Lesser known fact: onboarding quality strongly influences safety performance. Rushed induction increases error rates in the first weeks of employment. Seasonal staffing models depend on predictability. When attrition disrupts schedule, workload of remaining staff increases. Fatigue deepens. Oversight thins. Lesser known fact: workforce studies show that a 10% reduction in staffing can increase incident rates disproportionately if workload remains constant. The radios continued to misbehave. Sometimes they picked up fragments of conversations from outside camp, distant truckers or farm equipment operators. It sounded like ghosts speaking in half sentences. Lesser known fact: EHF radios can experience skip conditions where atmospheric layers reflect signals over longer distances than intended, causing crosstalk. Communication discipline eroded as interference grew. Staff repeated messages, spoke longer, filled silence with unnecessary chatter. Signal-to-noise ratio worsened. Lesser-known fact, in radio theory, clarity depends not only on transmission power, but on brevity and standardized phraseology too. Reduced channel occupancy. One evening, a thunderstorm knocked out cell service entirely. No bars. Parents could not reach children. Children could not text home. Anxiety rose on both ends of the line. Lesser-known fact, cellular networks rely on backup power at towers, but fuel supplies for generators at those sites are finite and can be exhausted during prolonged outages. Redundancy is expensive. Satellite phones cost more than most camps can justify, so they rely on infrastructure beyond their control. Lesser-known fact, during major disasters, restoration priority for utilities often favors hospitals and critical infrastructure over recreational facilities. In the final days of the second session, heat index peaked again. We shortened hikes, canceled afternoon soccer, moved crafts indoors. Kids complained of boredom, unaware that boredom was safer than exertion. Lesser-known fact, heat stroke can develop when core body temperature exceeds 104 degrees Fahrenheit, leading to organ damage if not treated rapidly. Heat mitigation requires shade, hydration, rest cycles, but cabins without mechanical cooling trap warmth overnight, preventing recovery. Lesser-known fact, wet bulb temperature, a measure combining heat and humidity, above 95 degrees Fahrenheit is considered potentially lethal for prolonged exposure, even in healthy individuals. The convergence arrived quietly on a Wednesday afternoon. A counselor fainted during canoe instruction. Not dramatic collapse, just a slow kneel into water, followed by confusion. We pulled him to shore, checked pulse, cooled him with damp towels. Lesser-known fact, heat exhaustion presents with symptoms such as dizziness, nausea, and fainting, often preceding more severe heat stroke. Medical evaluation later confirmed dehydration, compounded by a sleep deficit. Nothing permanent, but it was the first time the system harmed one of its own rather than a camper. That shifted tone of staff meeting that night. Lesser-known fact, organizations often react more decisively to internal injury than to near-miss events affecting clients. A pattern observed in occupational safety research. The director admitted what we all sensed. Budget was tighter than projected, repairs postponed, staffing stretched. He promised adjustments next season. Lesser-known fact, forecasting errors in nonprofit budgeting can arise from overestimation of enrollment and underestimation of maintenance costs, leading to mid-season austerity. The real reason something felt weird was not supernatural. It was misalignment between mission and capacity. Camp Oakwood promised enrichment, safety, adventure, but capacity financial, mechanical, human lagged behind promise. Lesser-known fact, mission drift in nonprofit organizations can occur when fundraising narratives outpace operational reality, creating structural strain. On the final night, we held closing campfire by the lake. Songs rose into dark, sparks drifted upward, and for a moment everything looked exactly like brochure. Parents arrived next morning with hugs and gratitude. They saw smiling faces, not maintenance logs. Lesser-known fact, positive end experiences disproportionately shape memory of events. A cognitive bias known as the Pecan rule. When the buses pulled away and silence returned, I walked once more along the perimeter trail. Orange tape fluttered on some trees, absent on others. The woods were unchanged, patient. Lesser-known fact, unmanaged woodland can encroach on trails rapidly during summer growth, obscuring boundaries within weeks. The horror was never a creature in the forest. It was arithmetic of neglect, physics of heat, psychology of fatigue, economics of thin margins. Nothing cinematic, just systems under strain, whispering warnings in static and sagging rope. Lesser known fact: in complex, adaptive systems, failure rarely begins with catastrophe. It begins with small deviations tolerated because they seem survivable. I left Camp Oakwood with sunburned neck and a notebook full of dates. I did not expose scandal. I did not rescue anyone from disaster. I simply learned to listen to hum of generators and tone of voices and weight of air in cabins. Lesser known fact: situational awareness, defined in safety science as perception of environmental elements, comprehension of their meaning and projection. A future status is considered the first line of defense against organizational failure. Something weird was going on, not in shadows of trees, but in spreadsheets and maintenance schedules and human limits, and that kind of weird does not vanish. When summer ends, it waits, patient as the woods, for next season to test whether lessons were learned or only felt.